Hello, this is Doug Tidwell and I need a haircut. I was recently sitting in my corner office admiring the scenery through my floor-to-ceiling windows when I received an email from Pharaoh Ramses II of ancient Egypt. Ramses writes, "Dear Doug, what's the deal with chatbots? Sincerely yours, Ramses II, rich in years, great in victories. Your Highness, thanks for that excellent and totally open-ended question. I'll talk about how to use the Watson conversation service to create a chatbot that understands several things you might want to do. A chatbot application has three basic parts. One is the back-end service that does natural language processing. The good news is that with Watson, we simply invoke that service. We don't have to write it ourselves. The second part is the data and logic that define the conversation. That's where you'll spend most of your time today. You'll define the things that your chatbot will work with and understand. The final part of a chatbot application is the UI. To keep today's video at a reasonable length, you'll use the UI built into Watson Conversation. We'll cover building a standalone chatbot application next week. So let's go to the cloud. Start in the IBM Cloud Catalog and search for Conversation, then click on the Watson Conversation service to get started. You can use the generated service name if you want. I called mine DWTV Convo. Scroll down to make sure you're using the Lite plan, also known as the free plan, then click the Create button. It will take a few seconds for the service to be created. When you see this panel, click the Launch Tool button to start building the chatbot. Click the Create button to create a new workspace. Give it a name and a description, then click the Create button. You'll see this panel. When you build a chatbot, there are three things you need to create. The first are intents. These are things that the user might want to do. In the case of Ramses II, those things are building a monument, hosting a feast, or starting a war. It's also a good idea to add intents like get help and start over to make the chatbot friendlier. Next are entities. Watson Conversation looks for terms in the user's input and maps those to entities. So, for example, if the king wants to build a monument, you'll need an entity to store the kind of monument he wants to build. As you would expect, the chatbot will have logic to make decisions based on the values of those entities. The final things you have to define are dialogues. A dialogue is the conversation piece of our chatbot. Ramses sees a prompt and responds, then your chatbot figures out the king's intentions and the values of entities based on his response. Given what the chatbot finds, it decides what to say back to the king. This interaction continues until the chatbot determines exactly what the king wants to do. So let's get started. You'll create a simple chatbot here to cover the basics. At the end of this video, we'll show you how to import a complete chatbot that shows several more advanced techniques. For now, create a new intent called Have a Feast. When you define the intent, add several phrases that the king might use. Watson's natural language understanding technology can match variations of these phrases, so the more unique phrases you define here, the more likely Watson will understand the king correctly. With that done, define two other intents that will be useful later, one called Start Over and one called Get Help. Now define an entity called Feast Type. There are three types of feast the king can host. One is called a sed, which I may or may not be pronouncing correctly. This was a great feast held in the king's 30th year and roughly every 3 years after that. An expensive affair, to say the least. If money is tight, though, we'll let the king host a potluck or have a food truck rodeo. Those are both a good time, but the king's money stays in the king's pocket. To wrap up, create a dialogue. Go to the Dialogues tab. The first thing to do is change the welcome dialogue to make it more appropriate for a king. With that done, create a new node below this one. Call the node Have a Feast. That's just a name that helps us understand what this dialogue does. Associate this dialogue with the intent Have a Feast. The tool has some nice autocomplete features, as you can see. Now click the Customize button and turn on the Slots feature. Slots let you define the entities that have to be filled in before this dialogue is complete. For this intent, there's only one, the feast type. Fill in the name of the entity. Notice that the tool stores the value as a variable we can use later. Create a prompt for the value, then create a message that the dialogue will deliver when the feast type is defined. Notice that you can use the variable in the message to the king. Now test out what you've done so far. Click the conversation icon in the upper right corner of the window. You should see your welcome message. If the king says anything that matches the Have a Feast intent, the dialogue kicks in and asks the king what kind of feast he wants. If the king says something that makes it clear he wants to have a particular kind of feast, the Slots feature takes us to the end of the dialogue automatically because the chatbot has values for all of the required entities. As you use the built-in UI, notice that Watson shows you what it recognized and how it relates to the intents and entities you've defined. That's all we'll do for now, but here's a look at some things the complete chatbot can do. Pyramids are completely out of fashion, so you have to encourage the king to build something else if he's got a pyramid on his mind. When the king says he wants to declare a war, the chatbot needs to know who the king will fight and where. For some enemies, the location of the battle can be inferred. For others, you have to ask. And finally, our Start Over intent has some JSON that resets the values of all the entities to null. The entire chatbot is stored as a gist at this URL. Look for the gist named Royal Valet, then copy and paste the JSON data into a file. From the Workspaces page, click the Import icon and choose the file. Make sure the Everything Radio button is selected and click Import. This creates a new workspace. You can rename it if you want, then open the workspace and click the conversation icon to work with the completed chatbot. In our next episode, we'll cover how to create these more advanced features and show you how to embed your chatbot in an application. But for today, we'll stop here. Your Majesty, I hope you, or at least the Royal IT Department, found this answer useful. And we'll see you again soon with another episode of the Developer Works Mailbag.